A warm breeze carried the scent of freshly baked bread and ripe peaches through the farmer's market, mingling with the hum of conversation and the occasional laughter of children darting between stalls. Savannah adjusted the strap of her leather satchel and tilted her sun hat back, letting the late morning light catch her face. She paused at the edge of the bustling market, her gaze sweeping over the patchwork of colorful tents and hand-painted signs. This was her favorite place to lose herself, but today she wasn't here to simply wander. She had a mission. The market was alive with the kind of energy that Savannah loved. Makers, growers, dreamers, all gathered in one place. Her sandals clicked softly against the uneven cobblestones as she wove her way through the crowd, occasionally stopping to admire a bouquet of wildflowers or exchange pleasantries with familiar vendors. She had been coming to this market for years, collecting stories as much as produce. Every face seemed to have some tale etched into its features, and Savannah had a knack for coaxing those tales out over a cup of coffee or a loaf of warm bread. Today, however, her mind was occupied with a specific vision. The open-air pavilion near the market's center was perfect for the storytelling workshop she had been planning. For weeks, she'd been dreaming of a space where children could gather on soft-woven rugs, their faces lit with wonder, as she spun tales as old as the hills and as fresh as the morning dew. She wanted to inspire curiosity, to ignite imaginations, especially in a world so often consumed by the glare of screens. But she needed the right setting, a place alive with the kind of magic that only a farmer's market could provide. Her attention was drawn to a vendor selling honey, the jars glinting like amber in the sunlight. The beekeeper, an older woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, waved her over. Savannah smiled, stopping briefly to chat about the bees and the sweetness of the honey this season. As the woman spoke, Savannah couldn't help but imagine how she might weave these details into her stories. A tale of a tiny bee braving storms to bring back the last drop of nectar for its hive. Lost in thought, Savannah nearly collided with a toddler who had broken free from his mother's hand. She crouched down just in time, steadying the little boy with a laugh before returning him to a grateful parent. "Careful, little adventurer," she said, her tone warm and playful. As she stood, she caught sight of the pavilion in the distance, a sturdy wooden structure draped in ivy. It was empty for the moment, its wide-open space beckoning her. Savannah quickened her pace, her heartbeat fluttering with anticipation. She imagined how the sunlight would filter through the leaves, dappling the faces of her young audience. This was it. She could already hear the rustle of pages and the hushed breaths of children leaning in, waiting for the next twist in the tale. Her fingers brushed the notebook in her satchel, as if to reassure herself it was still there, filled with scribbled ideas and sketches. As she approached the market manager's booth to inquire about the space, a flicker of doubt crept in. Would it be available? Could she convince them to let her use it for her workshop? Savannah shook her head, brushing the doubt aside. She had to try. After all, wasn't this what she taught her students every day? The best stories, the ones worth telling, were born from the courage to take a chance. With a deep breath, she stepped into the booth shade, ready to make her case. The sea had always been Marcus's sanctuary. Its quiet, its depth, its mystery, none of it ever demanded anything from him, yet it offered everything in return. But today, the farmer's market, with its chaotic energy, was his battlefield. He adjusted the strap of his messenger bag, stuffed with pamphlets and proposal notes, and surveyed the lively scene before him. The air vibrated with sounds he wasn't used to, cheerful bartering, bursts of laughter, the occasional bark of a vendor advertising their wares. For a man who spent most of his time listening to the hum of the ocean or the clicks of dolphins, it was overwhelming. Necessary, but overwhelming. Marcus wove through the crowd with quiet determination, his tall frame moving like a shadow among the bustling shoppers. His eyes, a cool gray that seemed to reflect the ever-changing tides, flicked from booth to booth, trying to pinpoint the market manager's station. He had no time to linger, though the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sight of plump, sun-warmed strawberries tugged at him. No, today wasn't about indulgence. Today was about securing the pavilion for his marine conservation exhibit. a chance to educate and inspire this community about the fragile beauty of the oceans, the ecosystems that teetered on the brink, and the small actions people could take to make a difference. It was rare for him to venture so far from water. His work was rooted in the sea, whether diving into its depths or analyzing samples in the lab. But when he'd heard about the farmers' market's pavilion, he'd known it was perfect. The families, the children, the sheer energy of the place, it was fertile ground for the kind of awareness he wanted to cultivate. He imagined the space filled with posters of coral reefs, jars of sand and sea glass for kids to touch, tanks of wriggling baby sea stars and hermit crabs to ignite their curiosity. He could already hear the questions, the gasps of awe. That was what he lived for. Those moments when someone, no matter how young or old, truly saw the ocean for the first time. A vendor selling handmade soaps called out to him, waving a bar carved to look like a seashell. Marcus shook his head politely, mumbling a quick thanks before moving on. He wasn't here to browse, and yet he couldn't help but notice the layers of life around him. The weathered hands of a farmer stacking crates of heirloom tomatoes, the laughter of a group of teenagers balancing precariously on the edges of a fountain, a child tugging on his mother's sleeve, pointing to a display of pies like they were treasures. Life, he thought, was everywhere, and that was why he was here. If people could see life in the market's simple offerings, fruits and flowers and soap, maybe they could learn to see it in the ocean too. Not just the vast, unknowable expanse of it, but the tiny moving pieces, the algae, the plankton, the creatures that lived and died in waters most people never thought twice about. Finally, Marcus caught sight of the market manager's booth, a wooden stall nestled at the edge of the pavilion. His pulse quickened. This was it. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag, the weight of his mission grounding him. He moved toward the booth, weaving through the crowd with purpose, his mind already rehearsing his pitch. He'd done the research, he'd brought the visual aids. This pavilion would become a gateway to the ocean for this landlocked little town, and he wouldn't leave until he made it happen. Unaware, he passed by a woman in a sun hat, her leather satchel brushing against his arm. He glanced back briefly, catching a glimpse of her before turning away. His attention was fixed ahead now, his focus sharpening. The pavilion loomed just beyond the booth, its ivy-covered structure practically calling his name. As he stepped closer, the noise of the market faded into the background. It was time to fight for his place, for the ocean's place. The market manager's booth was a small but sturdy wooden structure, strung with colorful bunting that fluttered in the breeze. Savannah stepped under its awning, adjusting her sun hat as the midday sun grew stronger. The manager, a stout man with a friendly smile and a clipboard perpetually in hand, greeted her warmly. "Savannah, haven't seen you in a while. What can I do for you?" "I'm hoping to reserve the pavilion," she said, her voice as bright and steady as she could make it. "For my storytelling workshop. It's perfect. Open, shaded, plenty of room for the kids to spread out, I think." She paused mid-sentence as a shadow fell over the booth. Turning, she found herself looking up at a tall man in a navy button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. His gray eyes, cool and unreadable, locked on hers for a split second before shifting to the manager. He clutched a worn messenger bag against his side, his expression calm but purposeful. "Sorry to interrupt," he said in a voice that was deep and deliberate. "I'm here about the pavilion, for the marine conservation exhibit." Savannah blinked, her mind stumbling as if she'd tripped over an invisible stone. "Excuse me?" The man turned to her, his brows knitting slightly, though his tone remained polite. "I've already spoken to the manager about it, and I was told to come by today to finalize the details." Savannah felt a flicker of disbelief, quickly fanning into irritation. "That's funny, because I've been planning to use the pavilion for weeks now. I've been working on this workshop for months. I just haven't officially reserved it yet." "Neither have I," the man replied smoothly, though his jaw tensed ever so slightly. "But I think you'll find that my event has quite a bit of scope. It's not just for entertainment, it's about education, awareness, things that could really make a difference in this community." "Not just for entertainment?" Savannah repeated, incredulous. She folded her arms, her sun hat tilting as she cocked her head slightly. Forgive me, but are you implying that inspiring kids to imagine, to think creatively, to fall in love with stories that shape how they see the world is somehow less important than whatever it is you're doing? I'm not implying anything, he said, his voice clipped. I'm just saying that marine conservation isn't exactly a luxury these days. I'd like to think we can agree the health of the planet might take precedence. Savannah felt her cheeks warm, not from the sun but from the sharp edge of his comment. She leaned slightly forward, her satchel brushing against her hip. And I'd like to think that teaching children empathy, curiosity, and a love for the world around them, including your precious oceans, might actually help them grow into people who care about conservation in the first place. The market manager cleared his throat, holding up both hands. Okay, now, no need to turn this into a standoff, folks. He glanced between them, his easygoing demeanor faltering under the tension crackling between his two visitors. It seems like you both have great plans for the space. Maybe we can work something out? I don't see how, Marcus said coolly, his gaze flicking back to Savannah. The pavilion needs to be set up for interactive exhibits. That requires time, materials, and space. A storytelling circle doesn't exactly lend itself to aquariums and displays. Savannah squared her shoulders, her fingers curling around the strap of her satchel. And I suppose your fish tanks and posters are going to be super flexible about being surrounded by a group of children sitting on rugs, listening to stories. Sounds like a perfect fit to me. For the first time, Marcus looked mildly exasperated, though he seemed to rein it in quickly. Look, I get that your workshop is important to you, but this isn't about personal projects. It's about urgency. This exhibit could change how people view the ocean. It could spark action. Savannah's lips parted, a retort ready on the tip of her tongue, but she hesitated. She saw something in his eyes, beneath the stoicism, a flicker of passion, a kind of quiet desperation. For a brief, disarming moment, she almost understood him. Almost. But she refused to back down. Let me guess, she said, her voice softening but still edged with defiance. You think I'm just here to tell some cute little stories and call it a day, but stories matter. They stay with people. They shape them. And if you think that's any less urgent than your work, then maybe you don't understand the impact of what I'm trying to do. The market manager sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right. Look, it's obvious you both feel strongly about this. Why don't I? Before he could finish, a sudden gust of wind swept through the market, causing a nearby tent to groan ominously. All three turned at the sound, their argument forgotten as a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Savannah didn't think. She moved instinctively, her sandals slapping against the cobblestones as she darted toward the unstable structure. Marcus was right behind her, his long strides quickly closing the distance. Whatever conflict had been simmering between them was suddenly irrelevant. There would be no winners if someone got hurt. The tent swayed dangerously, its metal poles creaking as the wind pressed against the canvas like an invisible hand determined to topple it. Beneath its precarious shadow, a group of shoppers stood frozen, their laughter and chatter replaced by startled cries. A stack of ceramic bowls on a display table wobbled, one crashing to the ground with a sharp crack. Savannah's breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she broke into a sprint, her sun hat tumbling from her head. Everyone, move back, she called, waving her arms to herd the startled shoppers away from the tent. A little girl clung to her mother's skirt, wide-eyed. Savannah knelt, her voice soft but urgent. It's okay, sweetheart, let's step back, nice and easy. She gently guided them farther from the danger, her pulse pounding in her ears. Behind her, Marcus reached the tent in a few long strides. His messenger bag hit the ground with a thud as he grabbed one of the sagging poles, yet his muscles straining as he pushed against the weight of the collapsing structure. The other side, he shouted, his low voice cutting through the commotion. Savannah turned, her head whipping toward him as she stood. For a split second, their eyes met, his filled with urgency, hers with resolve. She didn't hesitate. Darting back into the fray, Savannah grabbed the failing pole on the opposite side, her fingers slipping slightly on the cool metal. Together, their combined strength steadied the frame, though the wind continued to tug and buck against it like a restless beast. The ropes, Marcus barked, glancing around. Savannah spotted a set of frayed cords trailing from the corner of the tent. Planting her feet, she leaned her weight against the pole, freeing one hand to reach for the ropes. Her fingers trembled as she worked quickly, looping one around a nearby post and yanking it tight. "Got it," she called, her voice breathless. Marcus nodded sharply, adjusting his grip. "Hold steady." A vendor hurried over, his face pale but determined, and began helping Marcus secure the remaining supports. Slowly, the tent's groaning subsided. The poles straightened, the canvas settling back into place. Savannah stepped back, her chest rising and falling with the effort. She brushed loose strands of hair from her face, her gaze shifting to Marcus. He stood a few feet away, his hands braced on his knees as he caught his breath. "Nice work," he said finally, his voice rough with exertion. Savannah let out a soft laugh, the tension easing from her shoulders. "You too. Guess we make a pretty good team." For the first time, Marcus's lips curved into a faint, unexpected smile. "Yeah, I guess we do." Around them, the market slowly returned to life, the crisis averted. But for a moment, neither of them moved, their shared triumph hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. A soft drizzle began to fall, transforming the lively hum of the market into a quieter, more intimate symphony. Droplets pattered against the canvas of the tents, glinting under the golden glow of string lights that crisscrossed the aisles. Savannah instinctively reached for the brim of her sun hat, only to remember it lay forgotten somewhere near the collapsed tent. She glanced up at the sky, then over at Marcus, who stood nearby. His gray eyes lifted as if measuring the clouds. The cooling rain sent vendors scrambling to cover their goods, and shoppers ducked beneath awnings and umbrellas. Savannah felt the first cool drops on her shoulders, just as Marcus gestured toward a nearby canopy strung with twinkling lights. "Over here," he said, his voice low but audible over the soft rustle of the rain. She followed him without a word, the faint scent of wet earth rising from the cobblestones beneath their feet. The canopy was small but sturdy, its fabric catching the rain in gentle, rhythmic taps. Beneath its shelter stood a weathered wooden bench, and after a slight pause, Marcus motioned for her to sit. She hesitated but relented, settling on one end while he took the other, the space between them filled with the sound of the drizzle. For a moment, they simply sat in silence, the tension of their earlier argument dissipating like the steam rising from the wet ground. Savannah glanced at him, his dark hair damp at the edges, his posture relaxed yet alert, as though he were always ready to spring into action. She traced the line of his profile and found herself curious about the man who had so fiercely defended his cause, and who, only minutes ago, had helped her steady a collapsing tent. "You're not from here, are you?" she asked, breaking the silence. He turned to her, surprised. "What gave it away?" Savannah smiled faintly. "The way you walk through the market, like it's unfamiliar territory, like you're observing it more than being part of it." His lips twitched into what might have been a smile. "You're right, I'm from the coast. I spend most of my time out there, on the water." He paused, his gaze shifting. "This place, though, it's alive in a way I'm not used to. The people, the colors, the noise. It's different." She tilted her head, intrigued. "And yet, here you are, fighting for a pavilion in the middle of all this chaos." Marcus chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to catch him by surprise. "I guess I am." He rested his elbows on his knees, his voice growing more thoughtful. "The ocean feels like home. It's quiet, vast. But sometimes getting people to care about it feels impossible. Like shouting into the wind." Savannah studied him, searching his face. "That's why you're here. The pavilion, the exhibit, it's your way of making people listen." He nodded, meeting her gaze. "Yeah, I want them to see what I see, to realize how fragile it all is before it's too late." She shifted slightly, leaning forward, caught by the quiet intensity of his words. "What if the stories I tell could help people see that too? What if I could weave the beauty and fragility of the ocean into a tale that stays with them, long after they've left the market?" For the first time, Marcus's expression softened fully. "You really believe stories can do that?" "I know they can," she said, her voice steady. "Stories reach places facts can't. They make people feel. And feelings, more than knowledge, are what change the world." He leaned back, his gaze contemplative as he absorbed her words. Rain trickled off the edges of the canopy, the lights above them casting a warm glow that softened the sharp lines of their faces. "Maybe," he said quietly, "you're not as different from me as I thought." Savannah smiled, a real, unguarded smile this time. Maybe we're not. For the first time that day, the tension between them eased entirely, and as the rain slowed to a gentle mist, they sat under the canopy, their conversation weaving a fragile bridge between their two worlds. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the market as vendors began packing up for the day. Savannah lingered near a stand selling hand-carved wooden toys, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a small, intricate boat. She had planned to head home an hour ago, her satchel heavy with fresh produce and her mind buzzing with ideas for her workshop. But something had kept her rooted here, her feet refusing to carry her away from the place where she had spent so much of her day clashing and unexpectedly connecting with Marcus. Marcus. His name felt strange in her mind, like a word she wasn't sure she had the right to use. She couldn't stop replaying their conversation under the twinkling lights, the way his voice softened when he spoke about the ocean. For all their differences, she had sensed something kindred in the way he cared so deeply about his work, about inspiring others to see the world as he saw it. And yet, even as she smiled faintly at the memory, a knot tightened in her chest. "Savannah, you're still here?" The voice startled her, and she turned to see the market manager approaching, his clipboard tucked under one arm. His friendly smile faltered as he caught sight of her expression. "Everything all right?" She forced a smile, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Oh yes, just taking it all in. It's been a busy day." "Sure has," he said with a chuckle. "By the way, I just wanted to say how great it is to see you and Marcus both so passionate about your work. Not every day you get two people so committed to making a difference." Her smile stiffened at the mention of Marcus, but she nodded politely. "We certainly have strong opinions." The manager laughed, oblivious to her unease. "That you do. But I think you'll respect him even more when you hear this. He just made the regional paper a couple weeks ago. Some groundbreaking discovery involving coral regeneration. I read the article myself. Brilliant stuff. They called him one of the rising stars in marine biology." Savannah blinked, her stomach sinking. "They did? Yep, he's been giving talks all over the place. Universities, conferences, you name it. The kids around here are lucky to have someone like him bringing that kind of knowledge right to their doorstep." The wooden boat slipped from her fingers, clattering softly against the display table. She muttered an apology, quickly setting it upright, but her hands trembled as she stepped back. "Excuse me," she murmured, barely hearing the manager's cheerful farewell as she walked away. Her mind raced, her thoughts colliding in a tangle of emotions she didn't know how to untangle. Rising star, groundbreaking, brilliant. The words rang in her ears, louder than the chatter of the market, louder than the hum of her own heartbeat. She thought back to the way Marcus had spoken about his work, the quiet conviction in his voice. Of course it made sense now. Someone like him, accomplished, admired, would carry that kind of quiet confidence. He didn't need to prove himself. He already had. And what did she have? A satchel full of half-finished ideas, an unconfirmed workshop that might not even happen, and a life spent trying to convince people that stories mattered, that she mattered. She had poured everything into her students, her craft, her endless search for the magic in everyday life. But what did she have to show for it? There were no headlines for teachers spinning tales in a classroom. No conference circuits for stories whispered to children on rainy afternoons. Her footsteps slowed as she reached the edge of the market, where the crowd had thinned and the vendors were packing up in earnest. She caught sight of Marcus standing near his car, loading a crate into the trunk. He hadn't seen her yet, and for a moment she considered slipping away unnoticed. But as if sensing her presence, he turned, his gray eyes narrowing slightly as they landed on her. "Savannah?" He straightened, brushing his hands on his jeans. "You okay?" She hesitated, forcing a tight smile. "Of course, just a long day." Marcus studied her, his brow furrowing. "You seem off." "I'm fine," she said quickly, her voice sharper than she intended. She hated the way he looked at her, like he could see straight through her. "I should go." "Wait," he said, stepping toward her. Did something happen?" "No," she said too quickly, her hands clutching the strap of her satchel. "Nothing happened. You're busy, Marcus. I don't want to keep you." He frowned, his confusion evident. "Savannah, what's going on? Did I say something to—" "It doesn't matter," she cut him off, her voice faltering. She took a step back, her composure slipping. "I just— have a good night." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her heart pounding as she put as much distance as she could between them. She didn't know how to explain what she was feeling, even to herself. All she knew was that being around Marcus, his calm brilliance, his unshakable sense of purpose, was like holding up a mirror she didn't want to look into. And for the first time in a long time, Savannah felt small. Too small. The streets outside Savannah's apartment were quiet now, the kind of hushed stillness that only came after the world had moved through its busy hours and settled into rest. Rain slicked the pavement, glinting under the warm glow of a street lamp. Inside, Savannah sat curled in the corner of her couch, a quilt draped over her legs and a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The mug was one of her favorites, a gift from her students last year, painted with uneven brushstrokes and messy letters spelling out, "Best teacher ever." She traced the rim absently with her thumb, her eyes fixed on the small bookshelf across the room. It was packed tight, the spines of her favorite storybooks leaning together like old friends. Some were worn thin from years of use, pages dog-eared and covers fading. She'd read those tales to children so many times she could recite them in her sleep. Stories of brave adventurers, clever tricksters, and ordinary people who found themselves capable of extraordinary things. And yet tonight, she couldn't summon the usual warmth she felt toward them. Instead, a cold grip of doubt settled in her chest, heavy and unshakable. It was Marcus's voice she couldn't banish from her mind. "This isn't about personal projects. It's about urgency." Urgency. The word stung every time she replayed it, each syllable cutting deeper. She'd spent the afternoon convincing herself that her indignation was righteous, that Marcus simply didn't understand the value of what she did. But now, in the quiet of her living room, she couldn't ignore the flicker of truth in his words. Urgency. His work had it. The ocean had it. The fragile ecosystems he fought for needed someone like him, someone brilliant and focused, someone who could convince the world to listen. What did she have? Stories. Just stories. Savannah set the mug down on the coffee table, her hands trembling slightly. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself, as if it might shield her from the thoughts she'd kept at bay for so long. She had always believed, fervently and without question, that stories mattered, that they could shape the way people saw the world, fill them with empathy and wonder, and spark something deep inside that facts alone rarely could. She'd built her whole life around that belief, pouring herself into her students, her workshops, her stories whispered on rainy afternoons. But suddenly, sitting there in the dim light of her apartment, she wasn't so sure. She thought of Marcus again, the way his voice softened when he talked about the ocean, the way his eyes lit up with quiet passion. He didn't just tell people why they should care. He showed them through evidence, through action. He had facts, science, a brilliance that commanded respect. And he had the recognition to prove it. Newspaper articles, conference invitations, accolades that marked him as someone who was making a difference. What did Savannah have? A satchel full of half-formed ideas, a dream of a workshop that might not even happen, a classroom where the walls were covered with crayon drawings and glitter glued to construction paper. She loved her students. She would have done anything for them. But what if her work was too small? Too insignificant? If she disappeared tomorrow, would the world even notice? Her gaze drifted back to the bookshelf. At the top, tucked between two larger volumes, was a thin, well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. She reached for it almost instinctively, flipping it open to the title page. There, scrawled in blue marker, were the words, "Thank you for telling the best stories, Miss K," in the messy handwriting of one of her former students. She traced the letters slowly, her chest tightening. That boy, Caleb. He'd been shy and withdrawn when he first entered her class, barely saying a word to anyone. But over the months, he'd come alive, his world expanding with every story Savannah shared. By the end of the year, he was writing his own tales, filling a notebook with imaginative adventures he eagerly shared with her. She thought of the other students, too, of the little girl who had once whispered to her, "I want to be a storyteller just like you when I grow up." Of the boy who had struggled with reading until he discovered the series she'd recommended, devouring each book with wide-eyed excitement. Of the countless moments when she'd seen a child's face light up with the thrill of discovering something new. Were those moments enough? Did they matter in the grand scheme of things? Or were they just that? Moments? Fleeting and small, like drops of water falling into an endless ocean? Savannah leaned back against the couch, the book still clutched in her hands. Her throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly against the sting of tears. She wasn't someone who changed the world in big, dramatic ways. She wasn't a marine biologist with groundbreaking discoveries or a rising star in her field. She was just a teacher with a bag full of stories and a heart full of dreams. Was that enough? The room was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Savannah closed her eyes, letting the weight of her doubts settle over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she had an answer. The tide was out, leaving behind a stretch of wet sand that shimmered under the moonlight. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore filled the air, a familiar cadence that had always calmed Marcus, grounding him when the noise in his head grew too loud. Tonight, though, even the ocean seemed restless, its surface dotted with flecks of foam churned up by the wind. He stood at the water's edge, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, the salt-laden breeze tugging at his hair. The day at the market replayed in his mind, each interaction with Savannah sharper than the last. Her voice, her fire, the way she defended her work as though her life depended on it. It had stayed with him long after she'd walked away. And the look on her face when she left, guarded, closed off, the warmth he'd seen earlier replaced by something he couldn't name, gnawed at him. He hated that it lingered, but it did. Marcus exhaled heavily, the briny air filling his lungs. He'd come out here to think, to clear his head like he always did when the weight of his work became too much, but his thoughts only knotted tighter the longer he stood there. He crouched down, his boots sinking into the damp sand, and picked up a small piece of driftwood. Running his thumb along its smooth surface, he stared out at the horizon, where the water and sky blurred into an indistinguishable black. The ocean had always been his solace, his retreat. It was vast, unyielding, a place where he didn't have to explain himself or justify his existence. But it was also lonely. Out here, there were no voices, no stories, no one to tell him he mattered or that the work he did was worth the nights spent staring at data until his vision blurred. He'd chosen this path because it felt urgent, necessary. The planet was dying. How could he not dedicate himself to helping save it? And yet, in the quiet moments, when the accolades faded and the applause grew distant, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He tossed the driftwood into the waves and stood, brushing the sand from his hands. His mind drifted back to what Savannah had said during their argument. Stories matter. They stay with people. They shape them. At the time, he'd dismissed it as romantic idealism, the kind of sentiment that didn't hold up against the cold, hard facts he'd spent his life chasing. But now, standing alone on this empty stretch of beach, he wasn't so sure. Facts could educate people, but stories could make them care. And wasn't that what he was trying to do? Make people care? He clenched his jaw, frustration simmering just below the surface. Savannah had gotten under his skin in a way that no one else ever had. Her passion was undeniable, her belief in her work unwavering. And though he'd been irritated by her at first, he couldn't deny that it was also captivating. But it wasn't just her passion that lingered in his mind. It was the way she'd looked at him when she spoke about the power of stories. As though she could see straight through the layers of practicality and logic he wrapped himself in, as though she saw something in him that he barely recognized in himself, and he'd pushed her away. Marcus turned from the water, his boots leaving deep impressions in the sand as he walked back toward the small cluster of lights marking the edge of the town. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his fingers curling around the edge of a crumpled pamphlet he'd forgotten was there. It was from the market, one of the handouts he'd brought to promote his exhibit. He pulled it out and unfolded it, smoothing the creases as he walked. The pamphlet was full of facts, statistics, and glossy images of coral reefs, each page meticulously designed to educate and inform. It was good work, solid work, but as Marcus stared at it, he couldn't help but feel that something was missing. It was all so detached, clean. There was nothing here that made someone feel the way he felt when he was underwater, surrounded by the quiet, teeming life of the ocean. Nothing here that captured the wonder, the fragility, the urgency of it all. Savannah's words came back to him again, quieter this time, less a challenge and more a whisper. Stories reach places facts can't. He stopped walking, the pamphlet fluttering in his hand as the wind caught its edges. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been so focused on proving himself, on being the scientist everyone expected him to be, that he'd forgotten why he started this work in the first place. The ocean wasn't just a collection of data points and ecosystems. It was a living, breathing story. And if he wanted people to care about it, maybe he needed to tell that story in a way they'd remember. Marcus folded the pamphlet carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. He didn't know how to fix things with Savannah, or if she'd even let him try. But he knew one thing: he couldn't keep going the way he had been. The work mattered, but so did the people. And if he had any hope of reaching them, of reaching her, he had to start listening to the stories, even the ones he didn't know how to tell yet. The cafe was quiet save for the soft clatter of cups and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. Savannah hadn't planned on stopping here. She'd been on her way home from the bookstore with a new stack of treasures tucked under her arm. But the rain, sudden and insistent, had driven her to take shelter. She sat near the window, her satchel and books perched on the chair beside her, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The gray sky outside mirrored the haze of self-doubt that had clung to her since the weekend. She hadn't seen Marcus since the market, hadn't been able to stop thinking about him either, or, more accurately, about the way he'd made her feel, small, unsure, like her work was some quaint pastime next to his towering achievements. Her irritation had simmered into something quieter, something harder to name. It wasn't fair to blame him for her own insecurities, but the bitterness lingered like the aftertaste of overbrewed tea. The door to the cafe jingled, and Savannah looked up absently, her gaze flicking toward the sound. Her breath caught when she saw him. Marcus. He stood in the doorway, shaking rain from his hair and scanning the room with those storm-gray eyes. He hadn't noticed her yet, and for a moment she considered sinking lower into her chair, hoping to go unnoticed. But then his gaze landed on her, and there was no escaping now. He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before making his way over. Savannah straightened in her seat, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Savannah," he said, his voice low but clear. "Hi." "Hi," she echoed, trying to keep her tone light, her stomach twisted. She wasn't ready for this. "What brings you out in the rain?" He gestured toward the counter. "Needed coffee and space to think." His gaze drifted to the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" She hesitated, unsure whether she wanted to face the tangled knot of feelings sitting across from him might unearth. But then, with a sigh, she nodded. "Sure." Marcus slid into the seat, setting his messenger bag on the floor beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Savannah stared out the window, the rain streaking down the glass, while he studied the table like it held the answers to some unspoken question. Finally, he broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." That caught her off guard. She looked at him, her brows lifting in surprise. "An apology?" He nodded, his expression earnest. "At the market, I wasn't fair to you. I dismissed what you do without really thinking about it, and that wasn't right. I'm sorry." Savannah blinked, the words landing softly but with weight. She hadn't expected this, not from him. I appreciate that," she said slowly, "but it wasn't all you. I could have handled things better too. I guess I felt like you were questioning whether my work even matters." "I wasn't trying to," Marcus said quickly, leaning forward slightly. His elbows rested on the table, his fingers laced together. "But maybe I did, unintentionally. The truth is, I've been so focused on my own work, on trying to convince people to care about the ocean, that I forgot." He paused, choosing his words carefully. I forgot that there's more than one way to inspire someone to care. Savannah tilted her head, searching his face. What do you mean? He sighed, his shoulders hunching slightly. All my life, I've relied on facts and data to make my case. I thought if I could just show people the research, the evidence, they'd understand. But it doesn't always work. People tune out. They don't connect. And then you said something at the market that's been stuck in my head ever since. Her brow furrowed. What did I say? Stories matter, he repeated, his voice softer now. You were right. They do. Facts can inform people, but stories, they reach people. They make them feel. And I've spent so long dismissing that, I didn't realize how much I was missing. Savannah's lips parted slightly, his words settling over her like a gentle rain. She hadn't expected such vulnerability from him, and it stirred something deep inside her. Marcus, she said quietly, it's not like I have all the answers. Half the time, I'm just hoping what I do makes any kind of difference at all. He frowned, his gaze sharpening. Why would you think it doesn't? She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. Because it's small, she admitted. What I do, it's tiny compared to the scale of what you're fighting for. You're out there trying to save the planet, and I'm just trying to tell stories to a group of kids. Sometimes it doesn't feel like enough. It is, Marcus said firmly, the conviction in his voice startling her. When she looked up, his gaze was steady, unwavering. Savannah, I've studied ecosystems my whole life. I've seen how the smallest things can have the biggest impact. A single piece of coral can become a reef. A single story, it can change everything. You've probably changed more lives than you realize. She stared at him, his words sinking deep into the doubt that had been festering for days. Slowly, she smiled, a real, unguarded smile. Thank you, she said softly. He returned the smile, small but genuine. For the first time, the tension between them dissolved entirely, replaced by something warmer, something fragile and new but undeniably real. They sat in the cafe as the rain continued to fall, their words weaving a fragile bridge between them, one story at a time. The pavilion was quiet now, kissed by the soft orange hues of the setting sun filtering through the ivy. Savannah stood near one of the wooden support beams, her fingers brushing its surface absent-mindedly as she gazed at the empty space. It looked different in the fading light, less a site of conflict and more a blank canvas, waiting for something beautiful to unfold. She could still hear the echoes of children's laughter from earlier in the day, the murmur of the market as it had bustled around her. Yet, today's energy felt farther away than ever. Marcus's voice broke the silence behind her, steady but cautious. You're still here. Savannah turned, surprised to find him walking toward her. He held a large, folded map in his hand, likely something he'd been using to plan his exhibit. His usual stoicism was softened by the glow of the golden hour, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. I could say the same to you, she replied lightly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Didn't peg you for someone who lingers. Marcus gave a small shrug as he came to stand a few feet away from her. I guess I've been thinking. Dangerous habit, she said with a faint smile, though her tone carried genuine curiosity. What about? He glanced at the pavilion, his gray eyes scanning the beams and the open layout. About the market, about the pavilion, about us. Her brows lifted slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Marcus shifted, exhaling slowly. Look, I know we've been at odds over this space, and I understand why. What you're doing is important, Savannah. More than I realized at first. The confession caught her off guard, leaving a beat of silence in its wake. That's not what I expected you to say. Marcus let out a low chuckle, almost self-conscious. It's not what I expected to say either. But the truth is, the more I think about it, the more I realize you're right. Stories matter. They can reach people in ways facts can't. And maybe... He hesitated, as if weighing his next words. Maybe we don't have to fight over this. Savannah tilted her head, narrowing her eyes slightly. What are you suggesting? He took a step closer, holding up the folded map. What if we combined what we're doing? Your storytelling workshop, my marine conservation exhibit. What if it wasn't two separate events, but one? She blinked, taken aback. You mean together? Yes, he said, his voice gaining momentum. Think about it. Stories can be woven into everything I'm trying to show people. The ocean has its own stories, ones that are ancient and beautiful and urgent. And what better way to teach kids about conservation than through storytelling? You could bring the magic, the connection, and I could bring the science. It could be something bigger than either of us could do alone. Savannah's lips parted slightly as she considered his words. She looked around the pavilion, imagining it filled not just with her circle of rugs and eager faces, but also with the vivid, tactile experiences Marcus had described earlier. Tanks filled with starfish, displays of coral, hands-on activities that would leave an impression. The two worlds she and Marcus inhabited didn't seem so far apart anymore. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You really think it could work?" Marcus gave a small, tentative smile. "I do. I've seen how facts alone don't always stick. But if we could make people feel something, if we could inspire curiosity and wonder at the same time as we show them why it all matters, I think that could be powerful. And I think we could do that together." Savannah studied him for a long moment, her heart warming at the earnestness in his expression. She thought about her students, about the joy they found in stories, and the questions those stories inspired in them. She thought about the children who might leave this pavilion not just entertained, but forever changed, not just by her stories, but by the world Marcus could show them. "When you put it like that," she said, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, "it's kind of hard to argue." His smile deepened, still subdued, but genuine. "So, we're doing this?" Her nod was slow at first, then firm. "Yeah, we're doing this." They stood there for a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The tension that had defined so much of their early encounters seemed to dissolve in that instant, replaced by something new, something collaborative, hopeful. "I'll bring the rugs," Savannah said, her tone light but her eyes bright with determination. "And I'll bring the tide pools," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a rare hint of warmth. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavilion, they began to talk, their ideas flowing freely now. How to pair stories with exhibits, how to create a seamless experience that would engage and inspire. Excitement hummed between them, weaving a connection that felt as natural and inevitable as the tide meeting the shore. For the first time, the pavilion didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like a beginning. The pavilion was alive with the kind of energy that made Savannah's heart swell. The warm summer breeze carried the mingled sounds of delighted children's laughter, the gentle swish of turning pages, and the faint splash of water from the tide pools Marcus had carefully set up. Every corner of the space buzzed with life, transformed into a kaleidoscope of colors, stories, and wonder. The ivy-draped beams framed the scene like the set of a play, and for a moment, Savannah stood still, taking it all in. Clusters of children sat cross-legged on soft woven rugs near the center of the pavilion, their faces tilted upward, enraptured. Savannah knelt on one knee, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of her story. And so the tiny, brave sea star set out across the vast ocean, determined to find the glowing coral that would save her reef. Her hands painted shapes in the air, her words pulling the children into the tale like a tide drawing them to shore. Beside her, Marcus crouched by one of the shallow tide pools, his sleeves rolled up and hands submerged in the cool water. "See how this starfish moves?" he said to a group of wide-eyed kids. "It uses tiny, tube-like feet on the underside of its arms to crawl across rocks and sand. Isn't that incredible?" He reached into the water, gently turning the sea star over for them to see. "Careful now, just use 2 fingers if you want to touch. Be gentle, they're alive, just like us." A little boy, no older than 5, leaned forward, his tiny hand hovering uncertainly over the water. It's soft," he exclaimed, his voice filled with awe as his fingertips brushed the sea star's bumpy surface. "It's alive!" "That's right," Marcus said, with a rare smile, his voice warm. "And it has an important job to do, just like the sea star in Miss Savannah's story." Savannah glanced over, catching the moment, and her chest filled with a quiet pride. The line between story and science blurred so beautifully she could hardly tell where one ended and the other began. It was working, just as they'd hoped. She turned back to her audience and grinned. "And because the sea star was so brave," she continued, her voice carrying above the gentle hum of the crowd, "the coral began to glow again, lighting up the reef like 1,000 tiny lanterns. It became a place so magical that everyone who saw it learned to love the ocean just a little more. The children gasped, their eyes wide with wonder. A little girl with pigtails raised her hand. "Miss Savannah, do sea stars really live in glowing coral reefs?" Savannah smiled and glanced toward Marcus. "Why don't we ask Mr. Marcus? He's the expert." Marcus straightened, wiping his hands on a towel. "Well, not exactly," he said, stepping closer to the group. "But there are coral reefs in the ocean that are so colorful they almost look like they're glowing. And sea stars actually do live in reefs, along with all kinds of other incredible creatures. Each one has a role to play, just like in Savannah's story." The little girl beamed as if he'd answered the greatest mystery of the universe. "So the story's kind of real?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Kind of real," he said, his tone gentle. "And that's the amazing thing about the ocean. It's full of stories, some that we know and some we're still discovering." Savannah felt a warmth spread through her, a connection she hadn't expected when they'd first clashed over the pavilion weeks ago. She met Marcus's gaze, and for a moment they shared a smile, one that spoke of shared purpose, of something deeper than words. Around them, the pavilion hummed with activity. Parents wandered from exhibit to exhibit, some marveling at the vibrant posters of coral reefs Marcus had displayed, others flipping through the handmade storybooks Savannah had set out for children to take home. At a nearby table, a group of kids giggled as they painted their own sea creatures on paper plates, their hands smudged with bright, messy colors. One boy, about 10, stood beside a tank filled with hermit crabs, his fingers brushing the rim hesitantly. "Can I keep one?" he asked Marcus earnestly. "I'll take good care of it, I promise." Marcus crouched beside him, his voice kind but firm. "They're pretty amazing, aren't they? But these little guys belong in the ocean, where they can help keep the ecosystem healthy. That's their home. But you can help them by doing small things, like using less plastic so it doesn't end up in the water where they live. Every little bit counts." The boy nodded solemnly, and Savannah watched as he lingered by the tank, clearly mesmerized. She couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment that would stick with him forever, the one that would plant the seed of curiosity, maybe even a passion for protecting the ocean. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the pavilion, the energy in the space began to shift. The tide pools were being drained, the exhibit boards carefully dismantled, and yet the hum of excitement lingered. Parents stopped to thank Marcus and Savannah personally, their faces glowing with gratitude. "My daughter hasn't stopped talking about the sea star," one mother said, "and the story you told, it's all she wants to tell her friends about now." Savannah felt a lump rise in her throat. "That's wonderful to hear," she said softly. "Thank you." As the last families trickled out, Marcus turned to her, his hands tucked into his pockets and a faint, easy smile on his face. "I think we did it," he said. Savannah looked around the now empty pavilion, the memories of the day still vivid in her mind. "Yeah," she said, her voice full of quiet joy. "I think we did." The old library smelled faintly of paper and dust, steeped in the memories of decades gone by. Savannah traced her fingers along the spines of books on a shelf labeled Local Histories, her gaze lingering on a faded photograph pinned to the corkboard nearby. It showed a group of children sitting cross-legged in the library's tiny reading corner, their faces lit with rapt attention. In the center sat Mrs. Hartley, the librarian who had sparked their imaginations for years with her stories, her voice weaving magic into every word. Savannah felt a pang of longing and gratitude, thinking of the woman who had inspired her to do the same. She'd love this idea. Marcus's voice broke the silence beside her. Savannah turned to find him holding a slim volume, one of Mrs. Hartley's own self-published collections of local folklore. He held it with reverence, his thumb brushing its worn cover. "A nonprofit," he said quietly, "a way to keep her legacy alive. Stories and science, working together to teach kids what she gave to us, a love for the world." Savannah's lips curved into a soft smile. "You really think we can pull it off?" "I think we have to," he replied, his gray eyes meeting hers with quiet certainty. "What we did at the pavilion, that was just the beginning. This community needs more of that, more ways to connect, to learn, to care." She nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of purpose and emotion. "We'll call it the Hartley Project," she said. "For her, for everything she believed in." Marcus smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. For her. Together, they stood in the quiet library, the first seeds of their shared vision taking root. What started as a chance encounter had grown into something bigger than either of them could have imagined, something lasting.